Rain always made the ceremonial wool uniforms smell like wet dog and cheap brass polish. Thomas stood dead still, spine locking up, hating the monarchy, his pinching boots, and the pulsing ache behind his eyes. Then came the tug on his pristine white glove, a tug that ruined everything. Sweat pooled at the base of Thomas's spine, turning the thick cotton of his undershirt into a cold, clinging second skin. The ceremonial tunic, dyed an obnoxious shade of crimson that belonged nowhere in nature, weighed easily 15 pounds. The high collar, stiffened with plastic boning, dug a sharp, persistent crescent into the underside of his jaw. Every time he swallowed, he felt the friction. Swallow scrape. Swallow scrape. He had been standing on the slick granite block outside the western gate for exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. 48 minutes left until the changing of the guard. 48 minutes until he could retreat to the barracks, peel the saturated wool off his body, and swallow 4 ibuprofen to kill the hangover drilling into his temples. Tourists milled about on the other side of the wrought iron fence. They were a shifting mass of neon windbreakers, damp umbrellas, and glowing smartphone screens. A woman in a plastic poncho stood close to the bars, devouring a greasy pretzel. The smell of cheap yellow mustard drifted across the wet asphalt, mixing sickeningly with the ozone from the recent downpour, and the sharp chemical tang of the brass polish slathered on Thomas's belt buckle. He stared straight ahead, his vision fixed on an invisible point on the grey stone wall opposite the courtyard. By law and by punishing tradition, he was a statue. He was not a man. He was an ornament of the state, holding a loaded assault rifle that felt more like a stage prop than a weapon. His knees ached. It was a dull, thrumming pain that crept up his thighs, a reminder that human bodies weren't built to lock their joints and defy gravity without moving a millimeter for hours. If he passed out, and guys did usually the fresh recruits in the dead heat of July, he was trained to fall face forward. Breaking your nose on the pavement was honourable. Staggering backward or catching yourself was a dereliction of duty. Thomas hated the rules, hated the bloated aristocrats eating poached salmon inside the warm palace behind him. And mostly, he hated himself for needing the meagre pension this job promised. The crowd thinned as a fresh wave of drizzle began to fall. The grey sky pressed down on the city like a wet wool blanket. Thomas focused on the rhythm of his breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Keep the facial muscles completely slack. Then a disruption in his lower peripheral vision. Something small detached itself from the herd of tourists. It slipped under the heavy velvet rope, meant to keep the public a respectful 10 feet away from the sentry box. Thomas didn't move his eyes, but the shape registered in the bottom corner of his field of view. A child. She shuffled closer. The sound of her footsteps was wrong, not the sharp clack of rubber soles, but a wet, heavy slapping noise. She stopped roughly 2 feet from his polished black boots. Thomas ignored her. Kids did this constantly. Parents dared them to walk up to the guards to pull faces, to wave their hands trying to provoke a blink or a smile so they could capture the moment on video. It was a humiliating daily ritual. He braced himself for the inevitable taunting. He tightened his grip on the stock of the rifle, the wood slick against his white cotton gloves. But the girl didn't make a face. She didn't wave. A heavy scent drifted up to his nose, cutting through the mustard and the rain. It was the smell of old pennies, damp mildew, and unwashed hair. It was the distinct, sharp odour of profound neglect. Thomas broke his own rule and allowed his eyes to flick downward by a fraction of an inch. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her hair was a matted nest of dirty blonde strands plastered to her forehead by the rain. She wore a coat that was 3 sizes too large. The cuffs rolled up over her wrists, the fabric stained with dark, indeterminate patches of grime. but it was her feet that made Thomas's stomach twist. She was wearing men's slip-on shoes, completely soaked through, held onto her narrow feet by sheer willpower. Her shins were covered in a patchwork of purple and yellow bruises. "Excuse me," she whispered. Her voice was barely a rasp, thin and reedy, swallowed instantly by the ambient noise of traffic and distant chatter. Thomas kept his jaw clenched. "Go away," he thought. "Where are your parents? Go back behind the rope." He was not allowed to speak. A single word would cost him a week's pay. A movement would earn him a disciplinary hearing. He stared straight ahead. She stepped closer, invading the invisible boundary of his sentry box. The proximity made his heart knock unevenly against his ribs. He could hear her breathing now, a wet, rattling sound in her chest. "Please," she said. A tourist by the fence laughed loudly at a joke. A bus ground its gears on the main avenue. Thomas remained entirely rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute indifference. He had spent 4 years perfecting this apathy. He had ignored protesters, screaming in his face, drunks throwing half-empty beer cans at his boots, and women crying over broken hearts right in front of him. This was no different. She was a stray, someone else's problem. The city was full of strays. A small shaking hand reached out from the oversized sleeve of her coat. Her fingers were smeared with dark grease, the fingernails bitten down to the quick and lined with dirt. She touched him. It was a light pressure on the hem of his tunic, right where the thick fabric met his heavy leather belt. A clear violation of protocol, an arrestable offense for an adult. Thomas's throat seized. The protocol demanded he stamp his foot, bring his rifle to a port-arms position, and shout a standardized warning. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." It was designed to intimidate, to startle people into compliance. But looking at the fragile, bruised creature beside his boots, he knew that shouting would probably shatter her. He did nothing. He just waited for her to realize he was a statue, a prop utterly useless to her, and leave. She tugged. It wasn't a playful pull. It was a desperate, heavy anchoring of her weight against him, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting off its axis. The white cotton of Thomas's glove dug into his palm as he squeezed the rifle stock harder, his knuckles popping under the fabric. "They're coming," she whispered the words, tripping over each other in a frantic, wet rush. "Please, you have a gun. Please don't let him take me back." The cynicism that usually insulated Thomas, the thick, comfortable layer of apathy that got him through the miserable shifts, began to thin. He hated getting involved. Involvement meant paperwork. It meant standing in front of Captain Miller's desk, explaining why he broke formation. It meant docking his pay, which meant missing rent on his damp basement apartment. He squeezed his eyes shut for a microsecond, a desperate internal plea for her to just turn around and vanish. But then he heard the scrape of heavy boots on the cobblestone beyond the gate. Thomas shifted his gaze just enough to scan the crowd. Pushing through the sea of umbrellas and brightly colored ponchos was a man. He didn't look like a tourist. He wore a faded brown leather jacket that hung tightly across broad, heavily muscled shoulders. His face was a hard, aggressive slab of pale flesh, deeply pockmarked along the cheeks, his eyes scanning the courtyard with a frantic, predatory intensity. He shoved a woman in a neon windbreaker out of the way without looking at her. The man's eyes locked onto the sentry box, onto the little girl standing next to the guard. The girl saw him. Thomas felt the violent flinch rip through her small body. She let go of his tunic and shrank back, her oversized shoes sliding on the wet granite. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the sentry box, trying to make herself as small as possible, trying to disappear into the masonry. "I was just asking." She breathed out her voice, cracking tears, finally spilling over her dirty cheeks, cutting pale tracks through the grime. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She wasn't apologizing to the man in the leather jacket. She was apologizing to Thomas. She was apologizing for bothering a statue. She had realized in her terrifyingly small world that even the men in uniform, the men with guns and shiny brass buttons, were not there to help her. She was entirely on her own. Something ugly and hot fractured inside Thomas's chest. It wasn't nobility. It wasn't a sudden heroic urge to save the day. It was profound, bitter anger. He was angry at the rain. He was angry at the heavy wool tunic choking him. He was violently angry at the man stalking toward his post. And he was angry at the little girl for forcing him to care, for exposing the pathetic, ornamental uselessness of his entire existence. The man ducked under the velvet rope, sneering. "Get over here, you little rat," he barked. His voice was gravel and cheap tobacco. He didn't even look at Thomas. To him, Thomas was exactly what the tourists thought. He was a piece of the architecture. The man reached out his thick, scarred hand, lunging toward the girl's oversized collar. Thomas snapped. The movement was explosive, violently shattering hours of forced stillness. He didn't stamp his foot. He didn't shout the mandated warning. Instead, he ripped his heavy black boot from the granite block and planted it directly in the path of the advancing man. At the same time, Thomas swung the heavy assault rifle down from his shoulder. The movement was a blur of crimson and polished metal. He didn't aim the barrel that would be a lethal escalation he wasn't authorized for, but he drove the solid, weighted butt of the rifle hard into the center of the man's chest. The sound was a dull, meaty thud. The man gasped, all the air violently evicted from his lungs, and stumbled backward, his arms flailing. He tripped over the wet hem of his own jeans and hit the slick cobblestones hard his tailbone, cracking against the ground. A collective gasp went up from the crowd of tourists. A woman screamed. The clicking of smartphone cameras suddenly multiplied into a frantic mechanical buzzing sound. Thomas stood over the man. His heart was hammering a chaotic rhythm against his ribcage, pumping adrenaline and long-dormant rage through his veins. The suffocating tightness of his high collar suddenly felt irrelevant. He widened his stance, dropping into a perfectly balanced combat-ready position. The polished bayonet lug on the end of his rifle caught the grey ambient light. "Move back," Thomas said. His voice was harsh, cracking slightly from hours of disuse, sounding entirely foreign to his own ears. It wasn't a ceremonial shout. It was a low, ugly threat. The man on the ground scrambled backward, like a crab clutching his chest, his face twisting from shock into a mask of pure venom. "You crazy bastard," he spat, coughing. "She's mine. She's my ward. You can't touch me. I am a member of the Royal Guard." Thomas said, feeling a strange, dark irony in weaponizing the title he despised so much. "You have breached a secure perimeter. If you advance another inch, I will consider you an active threat to the estate, and I will put you down." It was a bluff. Mostly. Thomas's magazine was loaded, but the safety protocols were strict. Yet, looking into Thomas's bloodshot, hungover, intensely furious eyes, the man in the leather jacket didn't seem eager to test the bureaucracy. The man scrambled to his feet, shooting one last venomous look at the terrified girl. "This ain't over," he muttered, before turning and shoving his way back through the crowd, disappearing into the sea of tourists. Thomas didn't relax his stance until the man was completely out of sight. Slowly his breathing returned to normal. The heavy weight of his uniform settled back onto his aching shoulders. He had done it. He had ruined his career in the span of 30 seconds. He could already hear the sirens of the estate police responding to the commotion. He lowered the rifle, resting the butt carefully on the granite block. He turned his head, another blatant violation of protocol, and looked down. The little girl was still pressed against the stone, trembling violently. She looked up at him, her wide, exhausted eyes tracking the harsh lines of his face. She didn't look relieved. She just looked shocked that the statue had moved. Thomas slowly peeled the crisp white cotton glove off his right hand. He tossed it onto the wet stone. He crouched down, his stiff knees popping loudly in protest, bringing himself to her eye level. The smell of wet wool and sour milk hung between them. "It's all right," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a rough, quiet gravel. He reached out with his bare hand, ignoring the grime, and gently pulled the oversized collar of her coat straight. "You don't ever have to apologize for asking for help." Blue lights strobed against the ancient grey stone of the palace walls, cutting violently through the dull afternoon rain. The estate police arrived in a customized electric buggy that whined like a dying mosquito. 2 officers stepped out, their high-visibility yellow jackets blindingly bright against the muted, wet world. Their heavy duty belts creaked with every step. Radios spat bursts of aggressive, static-laced static into the damp air. Thomas didn't move from his crouch. His bare right hand still hovered near the girl's collar. His left hand gripped the wooden stock of his grounded rifle. His knees throbbed, a sharp, stabbing heat radiating up into his thighs, but the adrenaline had yet to drain from his system. He felt hyper-aware. He could smell the ozone from the electric buggy, the bitter tang of the officer's wet nylon gear, and the lingering sour panic rolling off the child huddled beside him. "Guard down, weapons secure." The first officer barked, a thick-necked man named Henderson, who always breathed through his mouth. Henderson unclipped his baton, his eyes darting frantically over the crowd of tourists who were now pressed against the iron fence, recording every second on their phones. "Status sentry, where's the hostile?" Thomas stood up slowly. His joints popped in a grim symphony. He picked up his discarded white glove from the wet granite and shoved it into his belt. "Hostile retreated south toward the main avenue," Thomas said, his voice flat, devoid of the military bark they expected. Male, white, heavy-build, brown leather jacket. He attempted to physically assault a miner within the perimeter. Henderson blinked, looking down at the shivering pile of oversized clothes and bruised shins by Thomas's boots. The police officer's face contorted into a mask of bureaucratic confusion. "A kid. You broke a level 1 static formation for a street kid." "I engaged a threat to the estate," Thomas lied smoothly. The cynicism coated his words like grease. The subject breached the velvet rope and demonstrated aggressive, unpredictable behavior. The second officer, a younger guy with nervous eyes, approached the girl. He reached out a hand wrapped in a black tactical glove. "Hey there, sweetheart. Come on out of the rain." The girl didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her reaction was much worse. She moved with the silent, desperate fluidity of a feral cat, scrambling backward on her hands and heels until she hit the sentry box. Then she scuttled sideways, putting Thomas directly between herself and the approaching officer. She grabbed the heavy wool of Thomas's trousers, her small, dirty fingers twisting the fabric into a vice grip. She pressed her face against the side of his knee. Thomas looked down. He could feel the slight, rapid vibration of her shivering through the thick wool. It felt like a low-voltage electrical current running straight into his leg. "She stays with me," Thomas said. Henderson scoffed a wet sound in the back of his throat. "Negative. Protocol dictates I just butt-stroked a civilian in front of 200 tourists." Thomas interrupted his voice, dropping an octave, losing the last shreds of professional detachment. "I'm already dead, Henderson. I'm walking back to the guardhouse, and she's walking with me. Try to pry her off, and we'll see how that plays on the evening news." Henderson stared at the wall of smartphones beyond the gates. The little red recording lights looked like a swarm of angry insects. He cursed under his breath, a foul, muttered string of syllables, and tapped his radio. "Control, we have the situation contained. Sentry is returning to barracks. We have a juvenile welfare situation, escorting them to the security wing." The walk back was agonizing. Every step Thomas took in his rigid, polished boots sent a shockwave of pain up his spine. The heavy crimson tunic, now soaked through at the shoulders, smelled intensely of wet dog and oxidized brass. The girl walked practically glued to his side. She moved with a limping, uneven gait, her oversized men's shoes slapping wetly against the cobblestones. She never let go of his trousers. They passed through the heavy oak doors of the staff entrance, leaving the rain behind. The sudden warmth of the building was suffocating. The air smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of heated air ducts. The bright fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, a persistent hum that dug right into the center of Thomas's lingering hangover. The security wing was a chaotic mess of cheap desks, ringing landlines and grey carpet that hadn't been replaced since the late 90s. The moment Thomas stepped through the glass double doors, the ambient noise died. 4 other guards in varying states of undress, some in undershirts, others polishing boots, stopped and stared. It was the ultimate taboo. A sentry off-post, weapon in hand, dragging a filthy civilian child into the inner sanctum. Captain Miller stood at the end of the room holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. Miller was a career man, heavily starched, deeply unhappy, and entirely devoted to the rulebook. He had a tight greying moustache that twitched when he was angry. It was currently practically vibrating. "Thomas," Miller said. The word sounded like a heavy wooden door slamming shut. "Sir." Thomas stopped. Protocol demanded he salute. He couldn't. His left hand held the rifle, and his right leg was currently occupied by a terrified 7-year-old anchor. "Weapon in the rack, now," Miller ordered quietly. The quiet was worse than shouting. Thomas walked to the armory cage. He cleared the chamber, the heavy metal clack echoing sharply in the silent room. A single brass cartridge ejected, spinning through the air before hitting the grey carpet with a soft thud. He locked the rifle into slot number 4. He felt a sudden, bizarre lightness in his hands, followed immediately by a heavy, sinking dread in his stomach. The adrenaline was leaving him, replaced by the crushing reality of what he had done. He had lost his job, his pension, and likely his freedom, all for a reflex. He turned back. The girl was standing alone in the middle of the room, hugging herself. Without his leg to cling to, she looked even smaller. She looked at the men in uniform, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. Thomas walked back and stood next to her. He didn't look at her, but he shifted his stance just enough so that his shadow fell over her, a small dark canopy in the harsh fluorescent glare. "My office," Miller said, his eyes burning holes into Thomas's wet tunic. "Bring the stray." Miller's office was a claustrophobic box that smelled of cheap cigars and lemon-scented furniture polish. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of the captain shaking hands with various minor royals people, with too much teeth and not enough chin. A heavy wooden desk dominated the space, covered in neat stacks of disciplinary forms. Thomas stood at attention. The girl sat on a rigid plastic waiting room chair pushed into the corner. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins, making herself a tiny, impenetrable knot of dirty fabric. She kept her chin tucked, but her eyes never left Thomas. "Sit down before you fall down," Miller said, waving vaguely at the chair opposite his desk. Thomas dropped into the chair. The faux leather hissed under his weight. He reached up with his left hand and began unfastening the high, plastic-boned collar of his tunic. The hooks were stiff. When the collar finally popped open, a rush of cool, conditioned air hit the raw, abraded skin of his neck. It was the best thing he had felt all day. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Miller asked. He didn't yell. He sounded exhausted. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I have the estate press secretary screaming in my ear. I have a viral video of one of my guards assaulting a civilian with a deadly weapon. I have an abandoned post." "He was going to hurt her," Thomas said. His voice was dull. The hangover was roaring back to life, a dull, rhythmic thudding behind his eyes. He craved darkness and 400 milligrams of ibuprofen. "That is a matter for the police, Thomas, not the Queen's Guard." Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "You are not a vigilante. You are a symbol. A symbol does not move." "A symbol is useless," Thomas shot back. The anger flared again, a quick, hot spark in his chest. "I stood there for 3 hours while people threw garbage on the ground. Then a man comes to drag a bruised kid back to whatever hellhole she crawled out of, and I'm supposed to stare at the masonry. Fire me, Miller. Do it. I don't care anymore." The door clicked open. A woman stepped in. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore a beige trench coat over a sensible pantsuit. She looked to be in her late 40s, with deep, dark bags under her eyes and a severe bob cut. She carried a battered leather messenger bag that smelled strongly of stale peppermint and old paperwork. "I'm Davies Child Protective Services," she announced to the room, not waiting for an introduction. She dropped her heavy bag onto the floor with a loud thump. She looked at Miller, then at Thomas, and finally her gaze settled on the corner. Davies's posture softened instantly. The severe bureaucratic edge vanished, replaced by a practiced, gentle curve of her shoulders. She crouched down, keeping a respectful distance from the plastic chair. "Hi there," Davies said, her voice dropping to a soothing, melodic register. "My name is Sarah. What's yours?" The girl pressed her face harder into her knees. She didn't make a sound. "It's okay if you don't want to talk," Davies continued smoothly. "It looks like you've had a really awful day. I just want to make sure you're safe now. That man who was chasing you, he can't get in here. You're surrounded by guards." The girl's head snapped up. She looked at Davies, then her eyes darted to Thomas. "He isn't," she rasped. The voice was still that thin, reedy sound damaged by cold and disuse. "He isn't what, honey?" Davies asked. "He isn't a guard," the girl said, pointing a trembling, dirt-caked finger at Thomas. "He's just a man." The observation hit Thomas squarely in the chest. It was so profoundly simple and entirely accurate. He wasn't the uniform. The uniform was a cage. He was just a hungover, angry, broke man sitting in a wet wool coat. Davies looked at Thomas, a question in her tired eyes. "She grabbed my coat," Thomas muttered, staring at the floor wax. "Begged me for help. The guy, he looked like a bad check. Leather jacket, pockmarks, smelled like trouble." Davies sighed, standing up and brushing off her knees. "Fits the description. We've got a foster home 3 miles from here, run by a guy named Gort, notorious for taking in state kids for the checks and using them for street begging or worse. We've been trying to build a case to shut him down for months, but the kids are always too terrified to speak. They just run, and he hunts them down." She looked back down at the girl. "Is it Gort, sweetheart? Is that who was chasing you?" The girl flinched at the name. A violent, full-body shudder. It was all the confirmation Davies needed. "Right," Davies said, her jaw tightening. She turned to Miller. "Captain, I need to take her down to the precinct for processing. Medical evaluation, hot meal, then a safe house. Out of the city." Miller nodded, looking relieved that the problem was being exported out of his office. "Of course. The side exit is clear. My men will escort you to your vehicle." Davies walked toward the girl, holding out a hand. "Come on, sweetie. Let's get you out of those wet clothes." The girl didn't take the hand. Instead, she uncurled from the chair, slid her oversized shoes onto the floor, and walked straight over to Thomas. Thomas stiffened. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He smelled her again, the old pennies, the damp mildew. It was the smell of surviving in the dark. She stood in front of him, staring at the brass buttons on his open tunic. Slowly, she reached into the deep pocket of her oversized coat. She pulled her hand out. Her small fist was clenched tightly. She reached out and pressed her fist against Thomas's palm, forcing his fingers open. She dropped something into his hand. Thomas looked down. Resting in the center of his palm, right next to the deep red crease left by the heavy rifle stock, was a crushed, slightly damp piece of hard candy. The strawberry wrapper was faded and torn at the edges. It was a pathetic, worthless piece of trash. It was probably the only thing of value she owned in the entire world. "For the statue," she whispered. Then she turned around and grabbed the hem of Davies's trench coat. She didn't look back as the social worker led her out of the office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing the room in silence. Thomas sat staring at the crushed strawberry candy in his hand. The humming of the fluorescent lights above felt deafening. He was ruined. His career was over. His bank account was empty. His head was splitting open. He slowly closed his fist around the candy, feeling the sharp edges of the wrapper dig into his skin. He slipped it into his trouser pocket. "Hand over your badge and your belt, Thomas," Miller said, quietly breaking the silence. "You're suspended pending a full tribunal. Go home." Thomas stood up. He unbuckled the heavy leather belt. He unpinned the brass insignia from his chest. He placed them neatly on the edge of Miller's desk. He didn't feel the crushing weight of failure he expected. For the first time in 4 years, stepping out of the uniform, he didn't feel like a prop. He felt entirely human. Stripping off the crimson tunic felt like cracking open a plaster cast. Thomas stood alone in the corner of the subterranean staff locker room, his fingers numb and clumsy as he worked the heavy brass buttons. The fabric peeled away from his saturated cotton undershirt with a sickening, wet, tearing sound. He let the 15-pound coat drop unceremoniously onto the slatted wooden bench. It lay there, a collapsed heap of ruined wool, smelling aggressively of oxidized metal, stale sweat and damp dog. He unlaced his boots next. Pulling his swollen feet free elicited a sharp hiss of pain through his clenched teeth. The skin around his ankles was rubbed raw, angry red welts, forming where the stiff leather had bitten into him for hours. The concrete floor of the locker room was freezing against his bare soles, but the shock of the cold was a welcome distraction from the pounding in his skull. 2 other guards were at the far end of the room, shining their gear for the night shift. Neither of them spoke. They didn't even look in his direction. The silence wasn't malicious. It was the uneasy, contagious quiet that surrounds a man who has just intentionally walked off a cliff. Thomas had broken the ultimate taboo. He had crossed the invisible line, separating the ornament from the world. And now he carried the stench of sudden, catastrophic unemployment. He didn't blame them for looking away. He pulled on his civilian clothes, a pair of faded black jeans and a worn grey hooded sweatshirt. Without the rigid plastic boning of the high collar and the heavy leather belt digging into his hips, he felt alarmingly light, almost off balance. He shoved his damp feet into a pair of cheap canvas sneakers. Leaving through the heavy steel service door, Thomas stepped out into the back alley behind the palace. The heavy afternoon downpour had finally exhausted itself, fading into a fine, suspended mist that cast a hazy halo around the orange street lamps. The air here didn't smell like lemon floor wax or expensive cigars. It smelled like wet asphalt, rotting cardboard from the nearby dumpsters, and diesel exhaust. He inhaled deeply, letting the bitter, polluted air fill his lungs. It tasted like reality. He walked for 20 minutes, his knees popping with every step, navigating the slick cobblestones and crowded intersections until the grand architecture of the estate gave way to the cramped grey concrete of his neighbourhood. The adrenaline had completely evaporated now, leaving behind a profound hollow exhaustion that made his bones feel like lead. He stopped at a brightly lit corner shop. The fluorescent lights inside violently assaulted his retinas. He walked down the narrow aisle, grabbing a blister pack of maximum-strength ibuprofen and a tall can of cheap, mass-produced lager from the refrigerated section. At the counter, he dug into the pocket of his hoodie for loose change. His fingertips brushed against a small, crinkled object. Thomas froze. He slowly pulled his hand out. Resting in his palm alongside a few dull coins was the crushed strawberry candy. The pink plastic wrapper caught the harsh overhead light. It felt entirely out of place in the grimy, practical reality of the corner shop. He paid the clerk, a tired man who didn't even make eye contact, and walked out into the damp night, keeping his right hand firmly buried in his pocket, his thumb gently tracing the ragged edge of the candy wrapper. His apartment was a basement flat 3 streets over. He navigated the steep, moss-slicked concrete steps down to the entrance and forced his key into the rusted lock. The door swelled from the humidity, requiring a harsh shoulder check to finally give way. Inside, the air was stagnant. It smelled of old cooking grease and the slow, inevitable creep of black mold behind the drywall. The only furniture was a sagging mattress pushed into the corner, a small laminate table, and a battered television sitting on a milk crate. It was a miserable, suffocating box. It was the reason he had stood like a statue in the rain for hours on end. Thomas tossed the blister pack and the beer onto the mattress. He didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, he walked over to the small laminate table and slowly pulled his hand from his pocket. He placed the crushed strawberry candy squarely in the center of the table. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning in loud protest. He popped 4 ibuprofen from the foil backing, tossed them to the back of his throat, and washed them down with a long, burning swallow of the cold lager. He stared across the dark room at the tiny speck of pink resting on the table. Tomorrow, the reality of his situation would crush him. He would have to face the disciplinary tribunal. He would have to hand over his heavily subsidized apartment keys within the month. He had no savings, no references, and a freshly printed record of violent insubordination. He was entirely undeniably screwed. The system he had fought so hard to appease had spat him out in an afternoon. Yet as the cheap beer settled in his stomach and the throbbing behind his eyes began to dull, Thomas realized his chest didn't feel tight anymore. The suffocating heavy apathy that had coated his throat for 4 years was completely gone. He looked at the candy, remembering the smell of old pennies, the bruised shins, and the terrifyingly heavy weight of a child trusting a stranger. He had ruined his life, but he had stopped being a prop. He was a man again, and for tonight, in the quiet damp of his basement flat, that was enough. If Thomas's rebellion against the cold indifference of his duty moved, you don't let this story fade into the background noise. Real life rarely gives us perfect heroes, just broken people making the hard, costly choice to finally care. Tap that like button to support raw, grounded storytelling, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that humanity still exists behind the uniform, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, unflinching narratives every single week. Catch you in the next one.